Week 5 of our sermon series, Life Hacks, and life hacks, but they're life hacks for tough times and rough relationships, because we all have them. And today, we're just going to get right into it today, so no messing around. You know what James says? This week, we're going to talk about something that's so serious, this might be, I think they're all this important, but this one might be the most important one of the whole series. When tempted. When tempted. You know what? James doesn't say if you're going to be tempted. He says when you're tempted. And we're going to be in James chapter 1 and James chapter 4. If you have your Bibles, you can go ahead and get there. But you know what scares me about that whole deal with when I say when we're tempted, or when James tells me we're going to be tempted? I realize this, that the problem I have is that I can be tempted. And you can be tempted. And if that's the reality. Hey, by the way, if you're here and you're just going to sit there like a dead fish, it's not going to help me a whole lot. So I need some interactive people, okay? Hey, seriously, the problem I hate is the fact that I can be tempted. And you may sit in there trying to put a little halo over your head and act like, not me, I've never been tempted. Don't be a liar today. Be honest. You can be tempted. And we can be tempted. And here's really the whole idea behind this lesson today that goes to what tempts us often is a source of our tough times and rough relationships. And that's the truth. And every one of us, we started this whole series talking about these tough times and rough relationships. Everybody goes through them. And the problem is the things that tempt us in our lives, those are the things that become the source of our tough times, the source of our rough relationships. Why do marriages fail? Because what tempted us sooner or later ended up blowing our marriage apart. And that's the truth. And we don't like to talk about things like this because it gets a little ugly at times, but the truth is it's hard, it hurts. And what tempts us, and this is why it's so important, what tempts us, did you get this, is often the source of your tough times. Hey, you young people that are here today, you got a lot of life ahead of you. By the way, I don't help define the young couples today, or young people, 30 and under. So if you're over 30, sorry, you probably in the middle-aged part of life, and stop pretending. My wife and I, we keep trying to tell ourselves that we're young. We're not anymore, okay? We're old. Some of you guys are really old, and you're like, you think just because you haven't retired yet, you're not. You are. I'm just telling you, it is. Life goes on, so let's get with this. But you know what? Hey, let's not lie to ourselves. Let's be honest today. And James, in fact, let's start off going to James chapter 4. And I just want you to, this isn't really the heavy part of the text, but it is part of what we want to see. This is what James is going to get us going today. In James chapter 4, in the first 3 verses, he says this. And he asks this question that really kicks us off. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And now, what a great question. When he talks about that, what he's saying to you, what he's saying to me is, why do I fight with my spouse? Why do I get upset with my coworkers? Why do I get mad at my parents? Why do things go wrong? What causes these feuds? Why do Democrats and Republicans hate each other? Why are we going through all these troubles? And James is going to give us the most practical of answers. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? And then he says, don't they come from, what is it? Say it loud. Come on, one more time. Somebody help Donnie say it. That's it. He says, don't these fights, don't these problems, my dad always says it takes 2 to tango. And maybe you don't get that, but what he was saying is you ain't fighting by yourself. There's always somebody fighting with you. And he says they come because of your desires that battle within you. He goes on in verse number 2, he says, you desire but you don't have, so you kill. Wow. James ratchets it up a little bit here. He says, you kill. What do you mean? You want that guy's job, so you assassinate their character. You say things in slanderous ways. You hurt them. You talk. You don't physically have to kill somebody. You can do a lot more damage. You covet, but you cannot get what you want. Why? He says, because you so quarrel and fight. You don't have because you don't ask God. Because we can't ask God for the things we're fighting for because they're wrong. He goes on in verse number 3, he says, when you do ask, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures. And the problem he's pinpointing here for us, at the core of all these tough times and rough relationships that we started off on, that we're trying to get these life hacks for, is my selfish desires. And that's hard, because it's my selfish desires that James is talking about here in the first 3 verses that causes these fights, these quarrels. And it's the selfish things that I do in my life that causes me to be at odds with my wife. And I just want to feel a little better. Let me just ask you this. This is a crowd participation thing, so please participate. But if you're sitting here today with someone, or you live with someone at home, they're not here today, but someone who has selfish interests and selfish desires, go ahead and raise your hand. Come on, be honest. I'm raising my hand. My wife should have her up. Where's my wife at? Get your hand up, dear. Now, some of you guys are like, I don't want to be honest today. I'm sorry. And you're looking over at the person sitting next to you, and you're like, I'm sorry. I don't want to call you out. Hey, the truth is, and this is something I learned a long time ago. Hey, you know what? I've worked for bosses that, are so selfish. They are so selfish. And it's just rough that I go to the store with all kinds of grocery store. There's all kinds of people there that bother me because they're all selfish. And a lot of the people I've worked with over the years, they have been selfish. And my wife, my dear wife back there, was so charming and delightful. When we first got married, she duped me into believing that she was not selfish, but she is. And let me just, I have to throw this one out here too. You know what? A lot of church members are selfish. Not our church, but other churches. And the culmination of it all is my wife had 3 children, and all 3 of those kids, you know what they are? They're all selfish. But you know how I know that? It's because they get in the way of all my selfish desires. That's what bothers me the most. Now, we've been laughing a little bit at this, but let's be honest here. That's the truth. Because how many of us, and you don't have to respond on this one, but how many of us could really personally own up to this statement that I am capable of being selfish? Because I can. And that's the truth. That's just what's in me, and that scares me. And that's what James is talking about here. He's saying in these first 3 verses of chapter 4, James, like, hey, you have the propensity to be selfish. And all these moms that are holding these babies, and they all know it. As sweet as those little children are when they smile, they're as selfish as can be because they want to eat when they want to eat. Our granddaughters, as much as I love them, they wore us out the 3 days they spent with us because, man, every time I turn around, they wanted something. When they wanted it now. And yeah, a lot of you guys got that feeling. And you get worn out quickly on that kind of stuff. You really do. And James here, he wants to help us win in this situation that we find ourselves in, the situation he's talking about here in the book of James with this situation of temptation, because that is a huge problem. And James, before we even get into this, as he helps us in this situation, he gives us this one thought, and I want to pass this along because it's a really easy thing to remember when you're facing all the problems of your life. You can win before you sin. I think some of us, we don't know that. We think, well, I got to sin. Sin or sin. I've said that 100 times. But you know what? When you became a saint, that is, you became saved, not because you're anything of yourself, it's God's righteousness on you, you can win before you sin. Hey, you know what? Paul told us in the book of Romans that you don't have to be a slave to sin anymore. You don't have to do that. And that's what James would tell us too. You can win before you sin. Everybody say that with me. You can win before you sin. The problem is so often my nature is I like to be tempted. And by the way, just let me say this on a side note, temptation is not sin. Jesus was tempted and he didn't sin. Temptation is not sin. Temptation, just to get that picture, God has drawn a line in the sand, and temptation is the urge to cross God's line. That's what it is. And so when we talk about this, everybody's going to be tempted to cross that line. So what James is trying to help us understand is you can win before you sin, and that's the biggest part of what we need to know. You don't have to. See, what James would tell you and what he'd tell me today, and he'd say, before you give in, before you lose the battle to do whatever you know you shouldn't do, think, because you can win before you sin. But how does temptation work? So today we're going to talk about, I normally have been giving you 1 life principle. Today I'm going to give you 2. 2 important life principles and 3 life hacks, and we're going to call it quits. 2 life principles, 3 life hacks. That's the whole idea. James chapter 1, though. Flip back to James chapter 1. We're going to read what James says because this is where we started when I first started talking today. James chapter 1, verse number 13, he says this, and there's the words, when tempted. Not if, when. He says, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. Important to know that. God didn't do it to you. Verse 14 says, but each person, once again, everybody in here is going to be tempted, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire. That's that selfish desires we have. And enticed. In verse 15, he says, then after desire has conceived, and notice the picture, he's using all kinds of great pictures here. He says, after desire is conceived, whose desires? Our selfish desires. Has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Death. And there's only one person that wants that death, and that's Satan. It's not God. It's not God. And then he says in verse 16, just to give us a little, I think James, as he's gone through this, he's just taking a quick breather and wants to give you just something real quick and easy to grab. He says, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Don't be deceived. In verse 17, he says, every good and perfect gift. There are good and perfect gifts out there. You don't have to lose. You can win. He says, every good and perfect gift is from above. It's not from within. It's not from without. It's from above. Coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. And that's the truth. And today, James, he wants to help us win in this battle over temptation. And so let me give you 2 life principles. The first one here is real simple. You can know the right thing, but do the wrong thing. Simple principle. Everybody say it with me. You can know the right thing, but do the wrong thing. And you know, that is such an important, and you say, well, that's no duh. But you know, we say we know it, but it really does come back to us so often. And really, Christianity, we don't always help ourselves a whole lot because we keep telling everybody, if we just do a little bit more knowing, then we'll be okay. No, you won't. Knowing isn't going to work just to get you past your problems. It won't get you out of tough situations in life. It won't get you through rough relationships, things you know. Because most of us know the right thing, but we do the wrong thing. Isn't it true? And it's a battle within us because this morning, you know, I don't know about you, but it was probably a battle within me and probably a battle within you to get up and go, get up, just get up, wasn't it? But you knew you needed to be in church, didn't you? In fact, there's people that won't be here today, and I'll run into them throughout the week, and they'll be like, oh, preacher, I'm so sad. So sorry I wasn't coming to church. And they go through this long, and it's almost embarrassing because I hate running into people like that. You know what I'm saying? You know why? Because they know the right thing, but yeah, it's true. James said in verse 14, he says, but each person is tempted. And you know what James is telling us? It doesn't matter how much you know. He didn't say, hey, if you know enough, you won't be tempted. He didn't say that, did he? Did he say that? Come on. He didn't say that, did he? He said, I know you know, but each person is tempted. Jesus Christ was tempted. Do you think you will be tempted? Yeah. Each person will be tempted. And it's going to happen. And I love, if you go back and read those verses that we read, verses 13 through 17, what you find here in the original language, the Greek, he actually uses a Greek picture of a fishing hook with bait on it. That's the actual picture here. It's amazing. And we all know about fishing, right? But it's the baited hook and the fish picture. And the fish sees the bait and remains blind to the hook. And we're sitting back going, well, that's stupid fish, right? Now, guess who the fish is in real life? Right? Come on. That's us, yeah, right. And because here's what we're trying to get us to understand. You can know the right thing, but still do the wrong thing. And James is saying, hey, you know what? That time you wanted something really bad, your wants overtook your will, didn't it? Mm-hmm. He said, your passion, the problem is your passion will dominate your reason. That's why we buy things we don't need. We don't tell our wives, right? Because they would, right? Or the wives don't tell the husbands. Because we know. Because we know it's wrong, but we're doing it anyway. See, you know what is right, but do what is wrong. And that's the problem. That's what temptation does. See, your immediate gratification overwhelms your long-term gratification. And you remain blind to the hook so you can get the bait. So information really doesn't change you. Information doesn't change how you act. Because you can know the right thing, but 9 times out of 10, you're still going to do the wrong thing. And that's why so many of us eat McDonald's. You say, what? I have a video clip, but I need to qualify it real quick. I am not endorsing the person speaking, nor do I endorse anything about it. He just says what I want to say in a much better way than I can say it, and hopefully it'll make you giggle a little bit if you can understand what he's saying. But I am not endorsing this man at all. But take a look at what he has to say about McDonald's for the soul.
I reference McDonald's a lot because I go to McDonald's. I love the silence that follows that statement. Like I just admitted to support dog fighting or something. How could you? McDonald's? It's fun telling people you go to McDonald's. They always give you that look like, oh, I didn't know I was better than you. No one admits to going to McDonald's. They sell 6 billion hamburgers a day. There's only 300 million people in this country. It's like, I'm not a calculus teacher, but I think everyone's lying. Because we all know better, right? We've all read the articles, seen those documentaries. It's the same message. Look, McDonald's is really bad for you. It's very high in fat and calories, and we don't even know where the meat comes from. And we're all like, that's disgusting. I'll have a Big Mac, a large fry, and a 2-gallon drum of Diet Coke. Because there's a McDonald's denial. We all embrace it. No one's going in there innocent. We're walking into a red and yellow building with a giant M over it. Was this a library? I'm tired of people acting like they're better than McDonald's. It's like you may have never set foot in McDonald's, but you have your own McDonald's. You know, maybe instead of buying a Big Mac, you read Us Weekly. Hey, that's still McDonald's. It's just served up a little different. Maybe your McDonald's is telling yourself that Starbucks Frappuccino is not a milkshake. Or maybe you watch Glee. It's all McDonald's. McDonald's of the soul. Momentary pleasure followed by incredible guilt, eventually leading to cancer. I'm loving it.
Now, once again, I'm not endorsing him, and some of you are like, oh, I can't believe you showed a video like that. He just said it in such a good way, because we all do. We don't like to admit it, but we know it's right, but we do it's wrong. And that causes us to do all kinds of goofy, crazy things, and then we pretend like we're not. So the question I would ask after watching that, what's your McDonald's temptation? What's your McDonald's temptation? Because you know it's wrong, but you still do it anyway. And that's the whole idea. Which leads me to the second life principle. You can choose if you fall, but you cannot choose to fall out. Say it with me. You can choose if you fall, but you cannot choose to fall out. And that is so important, especially you young people that are here today. Wow, you really need to get a hold of this one. You can choose whether you do or not. And the problem is we start thinking in our society, and this is what James would tell us, we start thinking, well, you know, what's the big deal? It's my choice. It's my life. I get to do whatever I want. What's the big deal to you if I fall into temptation? Who cares if I do something stupid? Well, first of all, there's a lot of people that care, number one. We do care. But you don't live by yourself. And you may think, you know what? Hey, I'm my choice. But what James, once again, would want us to understand is you don't have to fall. You don't have to. It's a choice. You don't have to fall into temptation. Hey, fish, you don't have to take the bait. You don't have to. Kids, when you go back to school this year, you don't have to cheat in school, even if other people are doing it. You don't have to. You don't have to, hey, you guys that work jobs, you don't have to do something dishonest to get ahead in business. You don't have to lie. You don't have to be lazy. You don't have to just because everybody else is doing it. Hey, you know what? You don't have to. Hey, you know what? Guys and girls, you don't have to live together before you're married and pretend like it's a trial marriage just because everybody else is doing it. You don't have to. That's what James is trying to tell us. Hey, you know what? You don't have to treat your wife horribly, guys, just because maybe your friend is. You don't have to give in to the lust of pornography just because there's millions of people doing it. You don't have to. You don't have to. But know this, that if you do, you don't get to control the fallout. And that's what we hate the most. See, we sit back and go, well, you can't tell me what to do because we're independent Americans. And this is where it gets stupid because we strive for our independence so much that we look at God and say, God, you don't tell me what to do. And God says, yeah, but you don't get to choose how it's going to end up. You don't get to choose the fallout. And this is so important. James is saying, hey, listen, you may think you're ready for that fallout, but you're not. And the things you set into motion are going to haunt you for years and years to come. And that's why I say, you young people, don't let it happen. You don't have to. You don't have to let your relationship fall apart with God. But if you do, understand there's going to be a fallout. There will be. In James chapter 1, verse number 15, James says, this is the fallout after desire has conceived. And you get the picture here, right? It gives birth to sin, swells, and it's a process because no one gets pregnant and the next day has their baby, right? It's a long, agonizing 40 weeks, ladies, right? Right? Come on, ladies. It's not fun. You don't do it because the pregnancy is so great. Like, I love morning sickness, right? I love throwing up in the toilet. Ah, it's so awesome. I love swollen ankles. I love all the things it does in my body. Is that why you do it? No, you do it because the love you have for your spouse and the love for that child. And you realize afterwards it is okay for the most part. And he says, that's the same process that you're going to go through. It's going to take a long, hard road on you to fall out. And it's going to give birth. And the birth, what you're going to get, you can't control because it's sin. And sin, when it grows up, it's not that beautiful little baby anymore. It's ugly. And it gives birth to something called death. And you die in a relationship to God. You die in a lot of different ways. And that's the problem we have. It's the journey of the fish, right? It's the journey of the fish. See, the fish doesn't know this, but the moment he grabs the bait, hey, the moment he grabs the bait, that's a good moment, isn't it, for the fish? Hey, don't ever let anybody lie to you. That moment of sin is pleasure, but it's only a moment. It's only a moment. And that fish, hey, he satisfies his short-term lust on that bait for just a moment, but what he doesn't realize is he soon will follow that hook up the line and into the hands of that fisherman who will flay him and eat him. And that's the truth. And that's the picture that James is trying to prevent. See, the moment you grab the bait of your temptation, you no longer get to make choices because the fallout is going to happen. And that's something we all should wake up to. So now that we've told you all these bad things, what do we do? And that's what James wants to help us with. What do we do? 3 life hacks, and we'll try and be quick on these. Number 1, resist it. Resist it. The first one's resist it. And James, back in James chapter 4, and we've been there, but in James chapter 4, verse 7, he says, submit yourselves to God, then to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. The beginning of verse 8, he says, come near to God, and he will come near to you. And so our first life hack, so simple. Hey, what are you supposed to do? Resist it. Resist it. Because remember, James says, you don't have to sin. You don't have to, so you can resist it. That's the first start. That's the most practical of all this. We always want to start with, hey, don't fall into the temptation, just like James is doing. Hey, James, what do? Resist the devil. Resist the devil, come near to God. Resist the devil by humbling yourself to God. Those are the easy things, or so we think, but they're not. James says, hey, you know what? You're going to have to enter into a renewal of resistance against temptation in your life. You're going to have to stand strong. It's going to be tough because the things that tempt you, they tempt you. Duh. They draw you to the place where you shouldn't be. They put you in places like McDonald's where you're eating things that you know are disgusting. Yeah, it's true, isn't it? And we can all sit back and go, yeah, I know a guy that had a heart attack. I know this. I know how bad it is. But we still go to our McDonald's. And I'm not, you guys realize I'm not really talking about McDonald's. I'm talking about whatever your McDonald's is. And we all have them. That's the hard part. See, James would tell you the same thing that Paul told Timothy and various other letters he wrote. You're in a battle. You're in a battle. And you want to know how to resist? He says, get closer to God. But you know what? Here's what I realized. All the years I've been in church and ministry and pastoring, you know what I've realized? When people get involved in temptation, whether it's crossing the line or yet to cross the line, you know what they don't do? They don't get closer to God, do they? They don't, do they? In fact, you know what I found? The people that are struggling the most with things that they're tempted to do, you know what they do? They make some kind of crazy excuse why they can't get to church, why they can't get to God, why they can't read their Bible, why they can't do what God expects them to do. And that's exactly the opposite, because God's sitting there going, don't cross the line, come to me, run the other way. I need to help you, resist. Resist what you know you need to resist. And you know, it's hard because I found this to be true too. Other people want you to sin with them. You know that? Birds of a feather flock together, right? Other people want you to sin with them. Other words, they want you to go to McDonald's with them. They want you to eat their fries. They want you to do that. In fact, have you ever been out with a group of people, like, we're going to go out to eat, and maybe you've been in this season of your life, like, I'm going to make better choices. I'm going to try and eat a little healthier. I'm going to skip dessert. And so you've pre-made all these choices in your head, and you're sitting there, and the meal's getting near the end, and the waiter or waitress comes out and says, can I interest anybody in some dessert? And your friend looks up and goes, yeah, bring us the menus. And you're like, no, I don't need one. I'm not going to have any. And everybody stops and gets silent. And they all look at you like, what? What? No dessert? And then they go, well, I'm having dessert. They've got great whatever, and they tell you whatever great is there. You need to have dessert. And you're like, no, I'm not really hungry. I ate enough. And like, what? But I'm having dessert. You need to have dessert. That's their whole argument. They keep saying that same thing over and over again. Have you ever noticed this? Am I the only one that's ever happened to? Come on. And they sit there and they do that, and they talk. I've been this guy that did this too. I have. I know some of you guys know this too. Which is crazy because I'm not even a dessert guy. But you sit there and you go, hey, I really don't want it. I'm just trying to make better choices. And they, oh, you're better than us? Oh, he thinks he's better than us. That's why he's not eating dessert. And they make this whole thing a big deal until what happens? Okay, maybe I'll just get a little something. And you get the biggest thing on the menu. You know why? Because they wanted you to sin with them. They wanted to feel better about their sin, their temptation, by having you take a fry with them. That's the whole idea. And let me just say this, you young people, I've addressed a lot to them today, but you young people, I want you to know you're living in the most intense cultural battle in our country for character. You really are. And the lies of your culture, the lies of your generation are this, that if you don't somehow indulge with them in the temptations that they're trying to entice you into, that you're judging them. Do you hear me? You're judging them, and you shouldn't do that because, after all, the Bible says don't judge. That's an absolute lie. You don't have to do it. And that's what James is saying. You don't have to. You can win before you sin. You don't have to. Resist. Resist it. Because you're in a battle now. And let me just give you this. This isn't one of my life hacks. This isn't even one of my truths. I should have written this down, put it on the slide for you and all this. But this is obvious, but this may be more experiential than anything. But you know what? The best way, listen carefully, the best way to resist McDonald's is to never go into McDonald's. Did you get that? I know it's profound. But the best way to resist whatever your McDonald's is, hey, you know what, you young people? You young ladies, you don't want to get pregnant before you get married? Then don't find yourself in a room with a boy by yourself. Don't find yourself in the back seat of a car, parked somewhere in the dark by yourself. Hey, you got problems with pornography? Then you know what? Maybe you ought to put the computer out in the middle of the room so everybody can see what you're doing. Yeah, I know, it's tense. You don't have to. You don't have to. In other words, what I'm saying is stay away from the danger zones of your life, and that's what James is saying when we say resist it. And the problem is so many of us, we go, well, I don't know, preacher. I just don't know how I fell into this temptation. I've talked to husbands who cheated on their wives, and they've said things like that. I don't know how I ended up in this affair. I don't know how I ended up falling into this temptation. And you know what the truth is? The truth is that we put ourselves in the very place where we'd be tempted because that's where we wanted to be. We got a whiff of the fries, and we thought, man, that smells good. And we forget how bad they are for us. And that's the truth. And then we pretend like we're going to resist when we fully intend to satisfy our appetites. That's the truth. And I want you to know, stupid has a fallout. It really does. Stay away from the danger zones. But more than just resist temptation, more than just avoid what is wrong, do what's right. Do what is right. See, so often we just stop with don't do wrong, but do what's right. You've got to do what's right. James buys into this. He says this, if you've never read this before, this is really important. James chapter 4, verse 17, he says, if anyone, once again, blanket statement for all of us, he says, if anyone then knows the good, remember we talked about knowing, they ought to, what is it? Do. They know, it's not just enough to know. He says, if anyone then knows the good they ought to do and doesn't do it, it is sin for them. And you know what he's saying? You don't have to. You don't have to do what's wrong. Replace what's wrong. Resist it. And then, hey, let's rise up and do what's right. Rise up and do what's right. See, when temptation comes, resist it. And do something good. And that's the whole idea. But that's only one life hack. And we realize this. If you fail to resist in a moment, you fail to step away from that line. If it gets the better of you, what do? If you cross that line, number 2, you ought to own it. Own it. Don't excuse it. Don't blame it on somebody else. My mom made me do it. My dad, you don't understand. My parents, they made me do it. My children, they made me do it. My boss, that woman, that man. No. James would tell us, own it. Don't excuse it, and don't blame it on God either, because that's what we want to do. And don't explain away your own sin. I remember years ago, there was a young man in our church. He'd grown up in our church. He surrendered to full-time Christian ministry, went off to Bible college, got married, went off to Bible college, and came home. And we hired him on staff to be a youth guy. And somewhere along the line, he got so messed up because he thought like some of you guys, like, hey, I'm going to get in ministry because I only work one day a week. And the rest of the week, I go out to eat with guys and play golf. I'm serious. He thought that. And he was shocked. I remember how shocked he was. Like, I didn't know we were going to be doing this. But he was this guy that really wanted to be a golfer. And we would always have these golf tournaments. And, of course, I like to golf, but I'm horrible at it. So no expectations there. And so I was in this golf group with a bunch of guys that I wanted just to hang around, not because they were all great golfers, but they were friends of mine. And he was in the group in front of us, and we were backed up waiting for him to tee off. And he shows up to this golf tournament, and he's got on Tiger Woods outfits. The Nike, he looks sharp. Man, he's got on, I don't know, his pants were like $180 because they're Tiger Wood embroidered or something. I don't know what they were. I'm in the Walmart specials. The Georges, you know what I'm talking about? Some of you guys know what I'm talking about. It's had. He's got on a special design Tiger Woods hat, and he went out, and he's got the clubs too. He's got the Tiger Woods Nike Golf Elite bag or whatever it is, and he spent all, and this guy, he's brand new out of college, and he doesn't have any money. I know he doesn't. He's a youth pastor, and I work on the same staff. I know he doesn't make more than I do. I know that, and so I'm just like, what? But he's spending all his money. I'm sure sitting there thinking this is going to be a problem for his wife when she finds out how much he spent. Because he's got Tiger Woods golf balls and I mean, just everything. He worshiped Tiger Woods. And I remember sitting there thinking, like, did he learn how to play golf somewhere? Like, is he really good or something? Because he looked the part. And he got up there and they took so long to tee off. And this is one of those tee boxes I didn't want to be at because it's the tee box right in front of the the club shop. And so everybody's there watching you. Like, I need that pressure. And he gets up there, and by now, the next group had already finished and come on behind us, and so we're backed up because they're all messing around. There was somebody else out in front of us that was taking forever. And the group behind us was even more intimidating because in that group, there was a guy who was in our church, and he had been a golf pro for years, and he was good. I mean, he was good. But he was nice about it. He didn't go around telling everybody how good he was. You could just watch him. He was good. And he stood there, he got out of his cart and just stood there and watched. And so this guy gets up there and he gets out his golf club and he takes some practice swings. And I'm like, well, maybe he knows what he's doing. And he gets up there and he puts the ball on the tee and he lines up and he's got all the fancy gear and everything. And he hits that ball and it goes about 30 yards. Now, if you're not a golfer, you're like, well, that might be pretty good. No, it's not at all. 30. In fact, I may have been generous on the 30 yards. He was embarrassed. And so one of the guys looked at him and said, hey, don't worry about it. It's probably just all the pressure. Go ahead and put another ball in there, and we won't even count that one. And everybody's like, yeah, go ahead, because we knew we were going to be behind. So he takes out another ball, puts it on top of that tee. He gets out with his fancy club. He gets out there, and he swings that thing, and it's worse. I mean, he topped it, and it went about 10 feet. And I remember he was turning red in the face, and I felt pressure for him. I felt also relieved because I couldn't do any worse than that, right? I know that's bad thinking, but this guy, he walks away, and here's where it got bad. He walks away. Now, he wasn't cursing or anything. I know guys that do that, but he didn't do any of that. He's a youth pastor, right? He walked away and made sure that everyone heard us like, well, this club is no good. It's a piece of junk, cheap piece of junk, when we all knew it was not a piece of junk. It was pretty expensive. And there was this golf pro, and he's standing there, and he, quietest guy, didn't say a whole lot, wasn't cocky or anything. He just sat there, and he leaned back, and he said, if you keep blaming the club, you're never going to change the swing. And I hope you get that, because that's what we do, isn't it? See, we cross the line of temptation, we go, it's my wife's fault I was drinking. No, it was your choice. It's a disease. No, it's your choice. You crossed the line. Uh-oh, yeah. Own it is what James would say. Own it. Don't glory in it, but own it. Own the fact that you did something wrong in a day and age where we want to blame everybody. We want to blame the government. We want to blame the president, blame everybody. Blame somebody else. Don't. Blame yourself because you chose it. And you did stupid, and the fallout's coming, and you can't control it, but you can own it. And that's the best way in a life hack. Some of us, we keep blaming everyone and everything for our sin, and we don't change our life, our lifestyles. And because of that, we're stuck in temptation's grip. And the fallout's huge. And we have relationship problems, and we have tough times, rough relationships, and we just sit back and go, I don't know why. Why is all this bad stuff happening to me? And we even turn around and blame God. And you know what James says? Don't do that. In verse 13, he says, God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. God didn't do it. See, one of the most criticizing things of God these days is, hey, if God's so good, why is there so much evil, right? But I think James would tell us the opposite in his verse 17 explanation. You know what James would say? If God is so good, then why do I get so many good things happen to me because I'm so bad? And that's the truth. James says, you don't have to. Resist it, but if you happen to, then own it. And not just own it, but number 3, confess it. That's the third life hack. Confess it. It's pretty simple. In chapter 4, we've read a little bit of this before, but I want to read verses 7 through 10 of chapter 4. Read it with me. He said, submit yourselves then to God, resist the devil, and he will flee from you. And we got that down. That's the resist factor. He goes on in verse number 8, he says, Come near to God and he will come near to you. And we've been here to this point. Now he says some things that are going to be strange. I had to read these things so many times, and some of you guys I don't know. Some of it is Old Testament allegory that he's going back and using, but he says, wash your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. In verse number 9, he says 3 words that are just so strange in this. He says, grieve, mourn, and wail. That's your advice, James? Grieve, mourn, and wail? Change your laughter to mourning and your joy to gloom. And that's how some people take their Christianity. Let's act like we were sad about being Christians. We're going to have to spend eternity with God. It's going to be bad. No, that's not what he's saying. Verse number 10, he goes on. He says, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up. And what James is trying to help us understand is this principle of confess it. See, the problem in American society, the problem in our culture, the problem in you and me is we don't like to own it. And we certainly don't like to confess it. And he says, don't just confess it by laughing it off. Some of us, we make sin our laughter. We joke about it. I remember a guy who used to joke all the time about his days where he was into drugs. In his teenage years, how he wandered into drugs and how he enjoyed doing drugs. And he laughed and laughed and laughed until his son got involved in drugs. Then it wasn't quite as funny. We have this tendency to laugh off sin. We make jokes about it. And we treat sin like it's entertainment when you know what it really is? It's Ebola, and it'll kill you. It is. And James is saying, hey, the only help you have, the only way you can get past this is confess it. And we need to deal honestly with it. We need to confess it to God and seek forgiveness. John understood it. Jesus' closest disciple, his closest friend. And John said this, we know this verse, in 1 John chapter 1, verse 9, he says, if we confess our sins, he, that is Jesus Christ, he is faithful and just and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness. That's so great. See, the goal is not that you would sin, but that you would resist temptation. That's what both John and James would tell you. But if anyone does sin, John says this over in chapter 2, verse 1, 1 John chapter 2, verse 1, he says, my dear children, I write this so that you will not sin, because that's his goal. I don't want you to sin. But if anyone does sin, if you didn't see this before, it's in there. He says, if anyone does sin, we have an advocate. The firm of God the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. They're working on your behalf. He says, we have an advocate. That means you have a legal counsel that stands in front of God Almighty, the judge of all the universe. He says, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ, the righteous one. See, God the Father is the judge, and Jesus Christ is our attorney. And he doesn't have to argue on what we did. He argues on what he did. And that's what's great about it. John tells us over in 1 John chapter 1, verse 6, though. He says, if we claim to have fellowship with him and yet walk in darkness, we lie and do not live out the truth. You can't be intimate in your fellowship with God and be comfortable with sin is what he's trying to say. And for some of us, that's the struggle we have because we want to make it okay that we are tempted. We want to make it okay that we step over the line. Well, I just had one drink. I just had one hit. I just cheated one time. I just flirted one time. I just did one little thing. God will forgive me. Yes, he will. But you know what? You can't claim to have fellowship with him and live in that. You got to confess it. Because he says in verse number 7, he says, but if we walk in the light as he is in the light, we have fellowship one with another. And that's not all. He says, that's just the small part of it. He says, and the blood of Jesus, his son, purifies us from all sin.